The draughty stone corridors of Ironfall Keep were locked in a state of perpetual frost, wrapped in a heavy, unforgiving winter mist that seeped through the very foundations of the ancient granite fortress. The massive stronghold had stood for centuries, an impenetrable monument to the strength of the ruling wolf packs of the north. But no winter wind howling beyond the high parapets, no matter how bitter or biting, could rival the absolute freezing agony currently pulsing beneath Lyra Vantazap's skin. She stood in the deepest, most forgotten corner of the palace archives, her head bowed in quiet, meticulous concentration as she dragged a frayed linen cloth across the spine of an ancient crumbling ledger. The towering bookshelves around her were constructed of dark, age-blackened oak, their heavy shelves groaning under the weight of thousands of historical tomes, sealed treaties, and lost ancestral magic records. The gold-embossed lettering on the dusty book caught the meager, flickering light of a single tallow candle, but Lyra's focus was entirely shattered by the relentless, throbbing ache radiating from her left arm. She stopped her rhythmic dusting, her slender fingers trembling violently as she carefully pulled back the frayed, oversized cuff of her grey serving dress. There, etched into the pale, delicate skin of her inner wrist, rested the cold claiming mark. It was a crescent-shaped scar, stark and hollow, entirely devoid of the shimmering, molten silver warmth that was supposed to signify a completed, harmonious, fated mate bond. Instead of glowing with the protective life force of an alpha, the mark was a dead, freezing white. It felt as though a jagged shard of pure glacier ice had been driven deep into her veins, constantly, ruthlessly leaching the heat from her blood. 2 long years. For 2 agonizing years, Alpha King Kaelan Ironfall had kept their fated bond a desperate, unspoken secret, leaving her mark completely unactivated and her social status reduced to a mere invisible shadow in his colossal keep. He had chosen the political stability of his kingdom over the ancient, sacred decree of the ancestors, bowing to the relentless pressures of his traditionalist council, while his true fated mate scrubbed the stone floors of his hidden library. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her right palm hard against the freezing crescent in a futile, desperate attempt to warm it. The chill had begun to spread higher and faster today, creeping past her elbow and settling into the deep marrow of her bones like a dormant, incurable sickness. She did not complain. She did not beg. She had accepted her hidden exile with a silent, dignified restraint that she wore like a suit of armor, but her mortal body was beginning to betray her iron will. The physical toll of the severed bond was becoming impossible to hide. Every breath she drew felt laced with winter frost. Her nights were spent shivering beneath thin woolen blankets, her body desperate for a phantom warmth that never came. The magic within her, suppressed and ununcored, clawed at her ribs like a caged, frantic animal, leaving her perpetually exhausted. "You are rubbing it again, child," a soft, maternal voice murmured from the deep shadows of the towering bookshelves. Lyra flinched slightly, her protective instincts flaring as she quickly tugged her woolen sleeve down to hide the damning mark. She turned to find Evelyn Blackwood standing in the narrow, dust-mote-filled aisle, holding a steaming, heavily scarred wooden mug. The head archivist of Ironfall Keep was a gentle, grey-haired she-wolf who moved with the quiet, deliberate grace of someone who was perfectly content to be forgotten by the loud, brutal, political world operating in the halls above. Evelyn's eyes, soft amber and deeply observant, tracked the slight, uncontrollable tremor in Lyra's pale hands. "It is just the draft in here, Evelyn," Lyra whispered, her voice slightly raspy from the dry, paper-scented air of the archives. "The granite holds the winter chill much longer than usual this season. I just need to keep moving." Evelyn did not smile at the brave, transparent lie. Instead, she stepped forward, the potent, earthy scent of crushed ginger, dried nightshade, and bitter chamomile preceding her, and pressed the hot mug directly into Lyra's numb fingers. The sudden stark contrast of the scalding ceramic against her freezing skin made Lyra gasp, a small, involuntary, sharp sound that echoed terribly in the cavernous silence of the room. "Drink it all. It will warm your blood at least for an hour or two," Evelyn instructed softly, her gaze dropping significantly to Lyra's covered wrist. "But we both know that no amount of ginger root or hearth fire can thaw a severed soul tie. You are fading, Lyra. I watch you grow paler, thinner, more translucent with every passing moon cycle. You are fading like a candle running out of wax." Lyra stared down at the dark, fragrant liquid, the thick steam curling into the frigid air and leaving damp condensation on her eyelashes. She took a deliberate, measured sip, letting the burning heat slide down her throat, desperately trying to chase away the frost-cold agony nesting heavily behind her ribs. "I am surviving," Lyra replied flatly, refusing to let the heavy, crushing despair crack her voice. "I have a solid roof over my head. I have my quiet work among the histories. I have the silence of this place, which is more than most outcasts are ever granted." "Silence is not a cure for a dying wolf," Evelyn said gently, reaching out a weathered hand to tuck a stray strand of dark, heavy hair behind Lyra's ear. "The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power. It creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. It is actively feeding on your dwindling life force to sustain the broken, unreciprocated connection." Lyra closed her eyes, the heavy, undeniable truth of the older woman's words hitting her like a physical blow to the stomach. Evelyn knew the absolute truth of what Lyra was. She had read the ancient, forbidden texts hidden in the restricted section of the archives. Veil walkers were born of the stars and the purest light, gifted with the sovereign ability to see through any illusion, to walk the spaces between the physical world and the cosmic realms, and to mend the broken fabric of magic itself. They were meant to be revered, to sit upon thrones as the ultimate truth-sayers of the Lycan territories. But without an anchor, without an alpha whose claiming bite could ground that overwhelming cosmic energy to the mortal plane, the magic became a volatile, consuming force. Lyra was carrying a trapped galaxy inside a fragile human vessel, and the vessel was violently cracking under the immense, freezing pressure of Kaelan's cowardice. It felt like a hurricane chained inside a glass jar, tearing her apart from the inside out, turning her own supreme gifts into a destructive poison. "He cannot claim me, Evelyn," Lyra murmured, her tone entirely devoid of accusation, completely emptied of any lingering, foolish hope. The council elders, especially Garrick Sterling, would never accept a low-status, orphandom archive Maid as their supreme Luna. They demand a pureblood, a politically strategic alliance to secure the fragile northern borders. Kaelan made his choice 2 years ago when he walked away from me in the winter woods. I made mine when I chose not to fight him for a crown I never asked for. And yet, he has not taken another to his bed or his throne. Evelyn pointed out quietly, her sharp, experienced gaze catching the microscopic flicker of pain in Lyra's dark eyes. He remains unbonded to anyone else. The Alpha King is suffering too, Lyra. The entire palace guard can smell the winter storm brewing in his blood. His temper is fraying to a dangerous edge. He is tearing himself apart to keep this secret, punishing himself for a choice Garrick forced upon him. His suffering is a political choice, Lyra countered, her voice hardening slightly as a rare, defensive spark of fire flared in her cold chest. Mine is a life sentence. I will not crawl out of this basement, walk up to the high table and beg a king to love me. If I am to be a secret, I will be a silent, perfect one. I will not break, and I will not beg. Evelyn sighed, a heavy, sorrowful, rattling sound that seemed to rustle the ancient pages of the ledgers sleeping on the shelves around them. She reached out and patted Lyra's frozen hand with deep, maternal affection. Pride is a heavy, beautiful blanket, my dear, but it provides no true warmth when the winter truly sets in. We are small things in a world of teeth, my Lyra. Smallness is a gift. Use it. Stay hidden, stay quiet, but do not let this freezing void consume your soul entirely before the ancestors decide to intervene. Lyra nodded carefully, taking another long sip of the bitter herbal brew. She turned her gaze back to the dusty gold-embossed ledger resting on the reading table. The archives were her sanctuary, a silent tomb of forgotten history where a girl who had never been seen could not be replaced, because she was never truly there to begin with. She would endure the somatic, physical agony. She would survive the freezing void. She would keep her head bowed and her heart locked securely away, pretending every single day that the most powerful, terrifying male in 3 realms had not completely, utterly shattered her universe. The transition from the hushed, dim sanctuary of the archives to the bright, cavernous, echoing main halls of Ironfall Keep was always a violently jarring, sensory-overloading experience. The faint, comforting scent of crumbling parchment that clung to Lyra's woolen dress was instantly overpowered by the sharp, thick smoke of burning cedar pouring from the upper hearths. Later that same afternoon, Lyra was tasked by the head steward to deliver a stack of newly restored territorial maps to the High Council chambers. She carried the heavy, thick parchment scrolls pressed tightly against her chest, using the rolled paper as a meager, physical shield against the ambient hostility of the upper palace. The grand corridors were constructed of towering, polished grey granite, lined with massive roaring hearths that blazed with enormous logs of pine and cedar, yet the air felt undeniably colder here than in the dusty library. It was the distinct coldness of sharp, evaluating gazes, of elite pack hierarchy, of a brutal society governed by rigid ancestral demands and absolute predatory authority. The sheer scale of the architecture was designed to intimidate, to remind every lesser wolf of their absolute insignificance in the face of Ironfall's ancient might. Frost clung to the corners of the high windows, refracting the harsh light into fractured, blinding prisms. Heavy crimson banners bearing the silver wolf crest of Ironfall hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting long, bloody shadows across the polished floor. Lyra kept her gaze firmly fixed on the stone tiles, her plain, unadorned grey uniform marking her immediately as the lowest rank of the pack, an invisible, unremarkable servant moving carefully through a dangerous world of gods and monsters. She navigated the bustling hallway, slipping silently past gossiping minor nobility, heavily armoured guards and rushing servants. Suddenly, her wrist began to throb with a violent, terrifying intensity. The dormant soul tie flared to life, a searing, blinding spike of sub-zero agony, shooting directly up her arm and striking straight into her chest like a physical spear. The air in the wide corridor abruptly felt unbearably thick, heavy with the overwhelming, intoxicating, hypermasculine scent of crushed pine needles, dark leather, and impending snowfall. Her breath hitched violently in her throat. She didn't need to look up to know exactly who was approaching. The fated bond, no matter how neglected, starved, or suppressed it was, acted as an undeniable, magnetic compass that pulled on the very center of her soul. Alpha King Kaelan Ironfall was walking down the exact center of the corridor, his massive, imposing, broad-shouldered frame radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying, unchecked dominance. He was flanked by a heavy contingent of elite royal guards and the most powerful, influential members of his inner council. Kaelan was a vision of lethal, untouchable royalty, dressed in dark, heavy winter furs and intricately forged obsidian armor that seemed to absorb the flickering torchlight. His winter storm eyes, a striking, turbulent, stormy grey, were fixed straight ahead, locked in a flawless mask of stoic, unfeeling authority. He moved like a predator perfectly at ease in his domain, untouchable and utterly supreme. Lyra instantly pressed her back tightly against a cold granite pillar, pulling the heavy maps closer to her chest to hide the sudden, violent trembling of her hands. She tried to make herself as physically small as possible, desperate to blend into the grey shadows of the stone, praying silently to the ancestors that the royal procession would simply pass her by without incident. Walking directly beside the Alpha King, matching his long strides, was Garrick Sterling, the lead council elder and the chief architect of her misery. Garrick's scent was sharp, clinical and foul, smelling strongly like stale mint and rusted iron. He was speaking in a low, continuous, insistent drone, his words cutting sharply through the ambient noise of the busy corridor. King Valorin's delegation arrives in exactly 3 days, Kaelin, Garrick was saying, his tone dripping with manipulative pressure, expertly framing his demands as absolute political necessity. Alpha Valorin Shadowvale is not a man to be underestimated, nor is he one to be kept waiting. The northern kingdom he rules is wealthy, ruthless, and highly traditional. If we are to secure this crucial border treaty, you must project absolute stability and dynastic strength. The Council strongly advises, no, we demand that you finally select a suitable, high-born Luna during the summit banquet. We cannot afford the appearance of a fragmented king without a queen to anchor his lineage. Kaelin's jaw ticked aggressively, the heavy muscles jumping visibly beneath his scarred cheek. My focus is entirely on the treaty, Garrick, not a mating ceremony. Do not push me on this. A king's fundamental duty is the survival of his pack, Alpha. Garrick pressed smoothly, entirely ignoring the low, dangerous, guttural rumble of warning vibrating deep in Kaelin's chest. A pure-blood alliance will silence the border disputes and secure our trade routes for a century. It is what the ancestors demand. It is what your crown requires. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut, her short fingernails digging painfully into the rough edge of the parchment scrolls. Every single word Garrick spoke felt like another thick layer of jagged ice wrapping tightly around her fragile, failing heart. She was standing barely 10 feet away, close enough to clearly hear the heavy, rhythmic, earth-shaking thud of Kaelin's combat boots against the stone floor. The physical proximity to her mate was actively tearing her apart. The void in her wrist screamed for completion, desperately, agonizingly reaching out for the warmth and protection of the man who was walking right past her. For a single, devastating, catastrophic fraction of a second, the royal procession faltered. Kaelin's heavy, booted steps hesitated mid-stride. He turned his head carefully, his winter storm eyes cutting sharply through the crowded hall, bypassing the wealthy nobles, the armed guards, and the whispering council members, locking directly and unerringly onto the small, trembling archive maid pressed against the pillar. The impact of his sudden gaze was a visceral, physical collision. The air instantly vanished from Lyra's lungs. Time seemed to fracture and splinter, dragging to an agonizing, heavy crawl. In that fleeting, silent moment of connection, the flawless mask of the stoic, unfeeling king completely slipped. Lyra saw the raw, desperate, bleeding agony swimming in the depths of his storm-grey eyes. She saw the violent, brutal internal war he was fighting, the feral, possessive beast raging endlessly against the heavy iron chains of his political obligations and his duty to his people. The severed fated bond roared between them, a desperate, invisible, sparking tether snapping taut, demanding with the force of 1,000 suns that he close the distance, drop to his knees, and publicly claim what was undeniably his. But Garrick cleared his throat, a sharp, cold, correcting sound that sliced cleanly through the heavy, suffocating tension. "Is there a problem, my king?" Kaelin's broad chest heaved as he drew in a sharp, ragged breath. The muscle in his jaw clenched so hard Lyra genuinely thought his teeth might shatter under the immense pressure. Deliberately, with an agonizing, torturous physical effort, the Alpha King dragged his eyes away from her pale face. He looked straight ahead once more, his expression hardening immediately back into an impenetrable, terrifying mask of glacial stone, and he continued walking. He ignored her. He chose his counsel, he chose his crown. He walked away without a single word, leaving his true, fated mate standing entirely alone in the freezing shadows of the corridor. The exact moment the visual connection was severed, a catastrophic, overwhelming wave of physical weakness crashed violently over Lyra. The hollow, unreciprocated scar upon her wrist pulsed with a blast of glacial cold so intensely absolute, it felt as though the blood in her veins had instantly frozen solid into jagged ice. Her vision blurred rapidly, the edges of the brightly lit, torch-lined corridor tunneling into a vortex of dark, rushing, deafening static. Lyra gasped loudly, her knees buckling completely under the crushing weight of the sudden, somatic collapse. She slid down the rough, unforgiving surface of the granite pillar, her body hitting the stone floor with a dull, heavy thud as the stack of newly restored territorial maps scattered widely across the tiles. She curled tightly into herself, clutching her left wrist desperately to her chest, her breathing turning shallow, ragged, and terribly uneven. She didn't know the Alpha King had dreamed of her face every single night for the past 2 agonizing years. She didn't know he was irreversibly losing his mind, violently destroying his private, heavily guarded chambers, when the sensory deprivation of their severed bond became too much for his inner wolf to bear. All she knew was the immediate, blinding, visceral pain of being publicly discarded, completely ignored and abandoned by the only soul in the universe meant to protect and cherish her. "Hey, watch where you drop those, you clumsy girl." A passing palace guard barked harshly, carelessly stepping over a fallen, valuable scroll without bothering to offer her a hand or a glance of pity. Lyra did not respond. She pressed her forehead against this icy stone floor, waiting in silent agony for the violent, spinning dizziness to pass. The freezing void inside her mark was no longer just a chronic, dull ache. It was rapidly becoming a terminal condition. The brief, agonizing spike of intense physical proximity, immediately followed by the harsh, active public rejection, had triggered a severe, catastrophic deterioration of her dormant Veilwalker magic. The ancient power, having no outlet and no anchor, was turning inward, aggressively cannibalizing her physical strength and immune system in a desperate, failing attempt to survive the unbroken, unnatural isolation. She lay there for several long, torturous minutes, her fragile body shivering uncontrollably in the drafty hall as the oblivious court moved around her. She realized with a quiet, horrifying, crystal-clear certainty that she was not just fading into the background. Her physical health was actively, rapidly failing. If she remained hidden in this keep, trapped forever in the inescapable gravitational pull of a powerful mate who continually refused to claim her, the magical cold would eventually reach her heart, and she would simply die. But she did not cry. She refused to shed a single, pathetic tear for a man who had cowardly chosen political power over his own soul. With an agonizing, monumental exertion of willpower, Lyra pushed herself up from the cold floor. Her limbs felt like they were filled with heavy, dragging lead. Her skin was alarmingly, ghostly pale, contrasting sharply and beautifully with her dark, heavy hair. She knelt on the freezing stone and methodically, carefully gathered the scattered territorial maps, her movements stiff, robotic, and mechanical. As she reached for the final fallen scroll, her numb fingers brushed against the thick, waxed seal of King Valorin's territory map. His sprawling northern kingdom was depicted as a vast expanse of jagged mountains and deep, ancient forests, a place where traditional magic was still worshipped openly. Alpha Valorin Shadowvale ruled that untamed land with an iron grip, but rumors whispered that he was a sovereign who valued raw power and ancient bloodlines far above petty council politics. Lyra traced the outline of his borders, a strange, inexplicable pull humming faintly in her chest. She quickly dismissed the sensation, attributing it to the lingering dizziness of her collapse. She had no business dreaming of other kingdoms or other kings. The grand, high-stakes diplomatic summit was approaching fast. King Valorin's notorious delegation would arrive in exactly 3 days. The entire keep was aggressively preparing for a massive festival of alliances, displays of wealth, and pure-blood dominance. Lyra hugged the heavy parchment scrolls tightly against her chest, drawing a shaky, freezing breath into her aching lungs. She would deliver the maps to the council chambers. She would return to the dark, quiet, safe sanctuary of the archives. She would continue to fade in absolute silence, a forgotten ghost haunting the edges of a kingdom that steadfastly refused to truly see her. She was determined to maintain her quiet, unbreakable resilience, completely unaware that the impending arrival of the rival Alpha King would permanently shatter the fragile, frozen world Kaelan had built and violently force the Alpha King of Ironfall to realize exactly what he was about to lose forever. 3 days had passed since the devastating physical collapse in the upper corridors. The grand courtyard of Ironfall Keep was consumed by a chaotic storm of frantic diplomatic preparations. The massive outer gates groaned against the biting northern wind, shuddering as they were repeatedly wrenched open to admit the arriving delegations. The freezing air was suffocatingly heavy with the aggressive, overlapping scents of a dozen different elite wolf packs, all vying for dominance in a cold space designed strictly to intimidate. Lyra Vance knelt on the unforgiving, slush-covered cobblestones near the sweeping staircase of the main entrance. Her slender, trembling arms strained agonizingly against the immense weight of a thick oak basin filled with boiling water and bundled cedar towels. The head steward had mercilessly assigned her to the outer washing stations, a grueling task meant for the absolute lowest ranks. The scalding water sloshed over the wooden rim, soaking the frayed cuffs of her thin grey dress and blistering her raw skin. Yet, terrifyingly, she could barely feel the burning heat. The icy imprint embedded in her inner wrist had escalated from a chronic ache into a parasitic black hole. It pulsed with a terrifying rhythmic intensity, actively leaching every ounce of ambient warmth from her fragile blood. The freezing void was spreading, turning her veins into rivers of sub-zero ice, a constant, agonizing reminder of the Alpha King, who continued to pretend she simply did not exist. A sudden, deafening blast from the perimeter war horns shattered the chaotic noise, instantly plunging the bustling crowds into a rigid, breathless silence. The Shadowvale pack had finally arrived. Through the swirling vortex of the winter blizzard rode the notorious delegation from the Northern Territory. They moved with a synchronized, lethal elegance that sharply contrasted with the heavy-handed posturing of Ironfall's own elite guard. At the center of the imposing procession rode their legendary sovereign. Alpha King Valoran Shadowvale was a terrifying, mesmerizing vision of absolute authority. He sat atop a colossal obsidian-coated warhorse, his broad frame draped in heavy, twilight-spun wolf furs, and intricately forged dark steel armor that seemed to absorb the harsh winter sunlight. His sheer presence caused a massive shift in the ambient atmospheric pressure. The scent of deep petrichor, dark amber, and crackling ozone rolled off the rival Alpha in intoxicating waves, forcing the surrounding warriors to instinctively bare their throats in subconscious submission. Lyra kept her head bowed sharply, her chin resting against her freezing collarbone as she scrubbed a patch of frozen mud from the bottom step. She made herself as physically small as possible, executing a masterclass in desperate invisibility. She was merely a ghost in a grey dress, a fractured, dying vessel, holding a suppressed cosmic galaxy, desperately trying to survive the bitter morning without drawing a single glance from the High Lords. The rhythmic thud of the rival king's boots echoed like hammer strikes against the wet cobblestones as Valorin smoothly dismounted. The royal procession began to sweep up the grand staircase, an unstoppable wave of dark armor and predatory power. As the Alpha passed the lower steps, he reached up with calm deliberation to unfasten the thick dire wolf leather glove from his right hand. The heavy black leather slipped loose from his scarred fingers. It fell silently through the freezing air, landing with a soft, wet slap directly into the grey slush, barely 2 inches from Lyra's bruised, shivering knees. Lyra froze entirely, her breath hitched sharply in her raw throat, her exhausted heart slamming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stared down at the mud-splattered glove, her entire body locking up in sheer panic. She fully expected a harsh command to retrieve the item and beg for forgiveness. She expected the brutal impact of a heavy boot kicking her out of the way. She expected the absolute, cruel indifference that Kaelin's arrogant court had systematically conditioned her to accept. Instead, the massive, terrifying king stopped completely. He did not signal for one of his armed guards to retrieve the fallen item. He did not snap his fingers at the trembling archive Maid. With a slow, fluid motion, Valorin lowered his colossal frame. The most feared alpha in the north dropped smoothly down onto one knee, completely ignoring the freezing slush soaking into his dark armor, and placed himself at exact eye level with a forgotten servant. Lyra gasped, a tiny sound of absolute shock, as her wide, frightened eyes collided directly with his. Valorin's gaze was a striking shade of deep, twilight violet. There was no cruelty in them, no predatory arrogance, and no cold dismissal. As he reached forward to gently retrieve his fallen glove, his bare, calloused hand brushed within a fraction of an inch of her covered left wrist. The rival king inhaled sharply. His broad chest expanded as he caught the faint scent buried beneath the harsh lye soap and boiling cedar water. He smelled the breathtaking aroma of fresh winter frost, mixed with the ancient metallic tang of dying stardust. His violet eyes widened fractionally, a flash of profound realization sparking in their depths. His highly trained instincts pierced straight through her pathetic disguise. Valorin could literally see the ethereal, cosmic glow of the Veil Walker magic pulsing weakly beneath her translucent skin. He saw the supreme lineage that the entire keep of Ironfall had been too blind or too politically arrogant to ever recognize. Lyra trembled fiercely, desperately pulling her raw arms back against her chest, overwhelmed by the sudden scrutiny. Because monsters do not kneel in the slush to speak to servants, her mind screamed in helpless despair, her fractured reality struggling to process the gentle reverence radiating from the towering beast before her. Because monsters do not look at me the way you do, Valorin did not speak a single word. To utter anything in the highly hostile courtyard would have instantly painted a target on her fragile back. Instead, he picked up his leather glove, holding her terrified gaze for one lingering second. He offered her a microscopically small, deeply respectful inclination of his dark head. A powerful sovereign quietly acknowledging a hidden queen, before rising smoothly to his full height and continuing up the stairs toward the waiting Ironfall Council. Standing exactly 10 paces away in the shadows of the stone archway, Sariel Thorne watched the bizarre, silent exchange with rigid, tactical unease. The royal guard's leather-clad hand tightened instinctively around the hilt of his broadsword. His sharp eyes tracked the broad back of the rival king, then shifted down to the pale archive Maid, still kneeling in the frozen slush. Sariel was a fiercely loyal protector of Ironfall, and his highly trained instincts screamed that the lethal ruler of the Shadow Pack had just found something infinitely more valuable in the mud than any diplomatic treaty the castle could ever hope to offer. As the late afternoon shadows began to lengthen over the stone keep, melting into evening, the distant roar of the grand summit preparations vibrated heavily through the thick granite walls. Yet the secluded archive gardens remained a sanctuary of absolute, freezing silence. The heavy, glass-domed enclosure at the back of the ancient library was built to cultivate rare medicinal flora. But tonight, jagged layers of white frost coated the glass panes, entirely blocking out the soft light of the rising moon. Lyra stood in the deepest, most shadowed corner of the garden, her numb fingers clutching a pair of rusted pruning shears. She was trying to focus on trimming the dead vines of the winter rose bushes, forcing her exhausted body to simply keep moving. But her physical deterioration had aggressively accelerated since the intense encounter in the courtyard. The brief, overwhelming proximity to an alpha of Valorin's staggering magnitude had deeply agitated her dormant magic. The severed claiming mark on her wrist was practically screaming, pulling the ambient temperature of her own body down to a lethal, shivering low. The void in her chest was constantly expanding, a cavernous emptiness that threatened to finally, mercifully stop her frantic heart. A few paces away, standing at a heavy stone workbench, Evelyn Blackwood was methodically grinding dried nightshade and raw ginger root with a heavy marble mortar. The earthy, bitter scent of the medicinal herbs hung thickly in the damp air, a potent smell that usually grounded Lyra's spiraling anxiety. But tonight, not even the head archivist's fiercely maternal presence could stop the uncontrollable chattering of Lyra's teeth. Suddenly, the ambient atmospheric pressure inside the glass dome shifted dramatically. The temperature did not drop further, but the shadows in the room seemed to stretch, bend, and bow respectfully toward the arched iron doorway. Lyra dropped the rusted pruning shears with a sharp, echoing metallic clatter. She spun around, her heart leaping wildly into her throat. Stepping silently out of the dimly lit corridor and into the frost-covered sanctuary was the rival Alpha King. Valorin had completely abandoned the High Lords, the lavish welcoming feasts, and the endless political posturing of the upper halls, deliberately tracking her unique, dying stardust scent through the labyrinthine bowels of the hostile fortress. Without his obsidian armor, dressed only in a finely tailored, dark silk tunic and supple leather trousers, he looked slightly less like a warlord and infinitely more like a lethal, creeping shadow. Lyra immediately dropped her gaze to the damp soil, her knees buckling instinctively as she attempted to drop into a deep, submissive curtsy. She was terrified of punishment, terrified that the head steward had sent this towering sovereign to the lower levels because she had somehow unknowingly offended him in the courtyard. "Do not kneel." Valorin's voice washed over the quiet garden, a rich, hypnotic, impossibly deep baritone that physically resonated in the hollow, aching space behind her ribs. Lyra froze mid-motion, her damaged lungs seizing. She cautiously lifted her head, her dark, heavy hair falling across her pale, terrified face. The rival Alpha was walking slowly down the gravel path, his striking violet eyes meticulously scanning the dying winter roses before finally resting entirely on her trembling frame. "You carry the pure light of the ancient celestial realms in your veins, little wolf," Valorin murmured, his tone dripping with a profound, unprecedented reverence that made Lyra's breath catch painfully. "Yet you are hiding in the dark, bleeding your sacred magic into the frozen dirt of a keep that does not even know your name. Tell me what they call you." "Lyra Vance," she whispered, the syllables feeling foreign, rough, and entirely unused on her own tongue. "I am only an archive maid, Your Majesty. You should not be down here. The grand banquet is about to begin." Lyra was completely wrong to think she could remain an invisible ghost forever, because the rival Alpha had finally discovered the absolute truth, and he was already stepping fearlessly into the dark to claim the magnificent treasure Ironfall had so foolishly thrown away. Valorin stepped closer, closing the physical distance with a slow grace that allowed her every opportunity to back away. He stopped just beyond arm's reach, highly respectful of her physical boundaries, yet radiating an overwhelming, protective aura of pure, undeniable sovereign power. His striking gaze dropped deliberately from her terrified eyes to the frayed, oversized woolen cuff hiding her left wrist. "You are rapidly fading, Lyra Vance," Valorin stated quietly, his voice laced with a heavy, dangerous edge of simmering anger that was not directed at her, but at the brutal injustice of her condition. "Your unanchored magic is collapsing inward. The bond you carry is entirely hollow, actively devouring your life force, because the male who placed it there is too much of a coward to properly anchor your light." Lyra gasped, her right hand flying up to instantly cover her hidden wrist. A panicked tremor racked her fragile frame. Outside of Evelyn, no one in the entire Northern Kingdom knew the actual fatal mechanics of her severed fated bond. The terrifying reality of being so perfectly perceived by a rival king left her entirely speechless, stripping away the heavy armor of silence she had worn for 2 agonizing years. Alpha Valorin. Evelyn's sharp, fiercely protective voice cut cleanly through the heavy tension. The older woman stepped completely out of the shadowed alcove, abandoning her mortar and pestle. She placed her own body firmly between the towering king and the trembling maid, her amber eyes flashing with a guarded maternal warning. The girl is not a political pawn. Whatever arrogant games you intend to play with King Kalen and the Ironfall Council, I respectfully demand that you leave her completely out of them. She has suffered enough at the hands of royalty. Valorin did not growl at the blatant disrespect of a lower-ranked wolf interrupting him. He did not bare his teeth or demand immediate submission from the fiercely protective archivist. Instead, the terrifying beast of the north smiled. A genuine, heartbreakingly gentle expression that completely contradicted his brutal reputation on the battlefield. I do not play political games with the sacred divine, head archivist, Valorin replied softly, offering Evelyn a solemn, formal bow of his head that left the older woman entirely stunned into silence. In my kingdom, we do not lock our stars in the basement. We put them in the sky, exactly where they belong. Valorin shifted his violet gaze back to Lyra, the intense warmth of his stare piercing straight through the thick, jagged ice surrounding her broken heart. He did not attempt to touch her. He did not make a single sudden movement that might frighten her further. You will not fade in the dark for much longer, Lyra, Valorin promised, his voice an absolute, unbreakable vow echoing in the quiet glass dome. I will see you at the banquet tonight. Do not keep your head bowed when I look for you. With one final, lingering look of absolute respect, the rival Alpha King turned and melted silently back into the dark stone corridors, leaving the frosted archive gardens exactly as quiet as he had found them. Lyra stood completely frozen among the dying winter roses, her blistered hands tightly clutching the rough fabric of her grey dress. For the first time in 2 agonizing years, she realized she was trembling, not from the lethal, sub-zero cold of her rejected, claiming mark, but from the sudden, terrifying spark of genuine, blinding warmth that had just ignited in the very center of her chest. Ironfall Keep's banquet room was a suffocating, cavernous theater of ancient opulence and lethal packpolitics. Thousands of thick, dripping tallow candles blazed furiously from colossal wrought-iron chandeliers suspended high in the vaulted ceilings, casting long, dancing shadows across the polished granite floors. The massive room was filled to the brim with the most elite, powerful nobility of the northern territories. The air was overwhelmingly heavy, thick with the intoxicating, aggressive scents of roasted venison, spiced honeyed wine, and the sharp, territorial pheromones of dozens of alpha wolves, subtly vying for dominance. Laughter and boisterous music echoed off the stone walls, creating a chaotic, deafening symphony of absolute indulgence. Lyra Vance moved through the labyrinth of crowded banquet tables, like a silent, invisible ghost trapped in a world of loud, vibrant color. She wore the exact same frayed, coarse grey serving dress she always wore, her dark, heavy hair pulled back into a severe, practical braid. In her pale, trembling hands, she carried a heavy silver pitcher brimming with dark, rich elderberry wine. The biting draughts sweeping through the cavernous room offered no reprieve from the oppressive heat of the roaring hearths pressing against her back, only serving to aggravate the deep ache in her bones. The lifeless soul tie marring her inner wrist had become a parasitic anchor of sub-zero ice, dragging her physical temperature down so drastically that her breath plumed in tiny, invisible clouds of white frost with every exhalation. Her unanchored Veil Walker magic was actively drowning in the freezing void, leaving her so profoundly exhausted she had to bite the inside of her cheek just to stay upright. She kept her gaze firmly anchored to the floor tiles, meticulously avoiding the sharp, evaluating eyes of the visiting lords and the cruel, mocking whispers of the Ironfall courtiers. Her singular goal was to survive the evening service and retreat to the silent sanctuary of the archives before her fragile heart finally gave out. The elevated dais at the far end of the room held the high table, a massive slab of polished dark oak reserved exclusively for the supreme rulers and the most influential council elders. Alpha King Kaelan Ironfall sat perfectly centered upon his imposing obsidian throne. He was a terrifying, flawless monument of glacial authority, dressed in exquisite dark velvet and silver-threaded formal furs. His broad, heavily muscled frame was rigid, his striking, winter-storm eyes fixed coldly on the chaotic crowd below. He projected an aura of absolute, unfeeling supremacy, flawlessly executing the ruthless, detached political mask his council demanded of him. Seated directly to his right, commanding an equal amount of terrifying gravity, was the guest of honor. Alpha King Valorin Shadowvale leaned back in his high-backed chair, a goblet of water resting loosely in his scarred, powerful hand. Valorin did not wear the heavy, ostentatious formal furs of the Ironfall court. He was clad in sleek, twilight dark leather and midnight silk that seemed to absorb the candlelight around him. His violet eyes were sharp, observant, and dangerously intelligent, tracking the subtle power dynamics of the room with the casual grace of an apex predator perfectly at rest. Lyra approached the high table with slow, agonizingly careful steps. Her heart slammed a frantic, painful rhythm against her bruised ribs as the heavy, intoxicating scent of crushed pine and dark leather washed over her. The sheer physical proximity to her fated mate was a visceral, tearing agony. The scent of his cedar and frost aura wrapped around her throat like a phantom hand, demanding a submission she refused to give. The rejected mating symbol throbbed violently, desperately screaming for the warmth of the man sitting just a few feet away. But Kaelan did not even blink as she stepped onto the dais. He did not turn his head. He kept his storm-grey eyes locked firmly on the distant doors, expertly pretending that the fragile, shivering woman pouring wine for his council simply did not exist in his universe. She swallowed the thick, burning lump of despair in her throat and moved mechanically toward King Valorin. She kept her head bowed deeply, raising the heavy silver pitcher to refill Valorin's goblet. Before a single drop of the dark wine could fall, Valorin reached out. His massive, calloused hand did not touch her, but he smoothly clamped his long fingers directly over the rim of his own silver goblet, entirely blocking her pour. "That is enough, Lyra," Valorin murmured. His voice was not a harsh bark of command, but a rich, hypnotic, impossibly deep baritone that carried effortlessly over the loud, chaotic din of the surrounding banquet. The immediate area around the high table went absolutely, terrifyingly quiet. The surrounding nobles, the gossiping courtiers, and the watchful guards stopped mid-sentence. The silence rippled outward like a dropped stone in a still pond, rapidly spreading until the entire cavernous hall was paralyzed by a rigid, breathless hush. Valorin stood up. The sheer physical scale of the rival Alpha, uncoiling from his seat, was mesmerizing and profoundly intimidating. He completely ignored the hundreds of shocked, wide-eyed stares focused directly on him. With slow, deliberate grace, Valorin reached out and pulled the heavy, velvet-cushioned chair sitting empty to his right, a seat strictly reserved for high-born dignitaries, and pulled it away from the table. "Sit with me," Valorin commanded gently, his striking violet eyes locking exclusively onto Lyra's pale, terrified face. A collective, horrified gasp echoed through the room. The head steward of Ironfall, standing near the steps of the dais, practically choked on his own saliva. "Alpha Kaelan," the steward sputtered frantically, stepping forward with his hands raised in absolute panic. "She is but a low-ranking archive maid. She is entirely unfit to dine at the high table with the sovereigns. We have high-born daughters of the council prepared to entertain you." Valorin did not even look at the steward. He merely shifted a fraction of his towering, dominant shadow aura outward. The oppressive, crackling weight of his sovereign magic instantly slammed into the steward, forcing the man to drop to his knees on the stone floor, completely silenced by the terrifying pressure. "I did not ask for the council's daughters," Valorin stated, his voice a lethal, silken whisper that promised absolute destruction to anyone who dared to challenge him. "I asked the lady to sit." Lyra was shaking so violently. The silver pitcher rattled audibly in her hands. She looked frantically toward the center of the table, her dark eyes wide with helpless terror, instinctively seeking guidance from the only man who possessed the authority to stop this. Kaelan was staring directly at her. His flawless glacial mask had completely, violently fractured. The Alpha King's knuckles were stark white as his large hands gripped the heavy, carved armrests of his obsidian throne. His jaw was locked so tightly, a muscle jumped erratically beneath his scarred cheek. Yet, chained by the suffocating political optics he had built, paralyzed by the presence of Elder Garrick Sterling sitting rigidly to his left, Kaelan did not speak. He did not issue an order. He remained trapped in a prison of his own making, his storm-grey eyes burning with a desperate, suffocating helplessness. Seeing that her mate would not protect her from the public spectacle, Lyra slowly, carefully set the heavy silver pitcher down on the oak table. She did not complain. She did not beg for an escape. With a quiet, dignified resignation that radiated a heartbreaking strength, she stepped forward and sat cautiously on the very edge of the velvet-cushioned chair. Valorin smiled, a genuine warm expression that instantly softened the harsh, lethal angles of his face. He sat back down beside her, entirely unbothered by the hundreds of scandalized whispers now furiously echoing through the banquet room. "You are shivering, little wolf," Valorin observed quietly, his deep voice meant only for her ears. Before Lyra could attempt to formulate a polite, evasive lie, Valorin reached inside the dark, silk-lined lapel of his formal tunic. He withdrew a long, exquisite length of fabric. It was a rare, moon-woven silver ribbon. The material caught the flickering candlelight, shimmering with a soft, ethereal starlight that seemed to perfectly match the hidden, suppressed Veilwalker magic locked deep inside Lyra's failing veins. In the ancient traditions of the Northern Pax, presenting a woman with a silver ribbon in a public forum was the highest symbol of absolute, honorable courtship. It was a formal declaration of intent, a public vow of protection and deep romantic interest. The whispers in the room instantly escalated into a frantic, deafening uproar. "May I?" Valorin asked, his violet eyes completely sincere, offering her absolute choice and uncompromised respect in a room that had treated her as entirely invisible for 2 agonizing years. Lyra was entirely paralyzed. The profound, undeniable kindness in his gaze was a devastating contrast to the freezing void in her chest. She gave a microscopic, barely perceptible nod. Valorin reached out, his movements incredibly slow and broadcasted. He did not touch her skin, deeply respectful of her boundaries. Instead, he reached toward the frayed, oversized cuff of her left sleeve, the exact sleeve hiding her dying, rejected, fated bond. With meticulous, gentle precision, he wrapped the shimmering silver ribbon around the outside of the coarse grey wool, tying it into a secure, elegant knot directly over her frozen scar. The moment the moon silk settled over her skin, a sudden, shocking wave of ambient warmth radiated through the material. It did not heal the severed fated bond, but the rare magical properties of the silver ribbon acted as a physical buffer, soothing the violent, sub-zero throbbing of her claiming mark. For the first time in 24 months, Lyra drew a deep, full breath of air that did not taste like jagged winter frost. At the exact center of the high table, a sharp, explosive cracking sound shattered the ambient noise. Kaelan Ironfall's heavy, crystal wine goblet completely shattered inside his crushing, white-knuckled grip. Sharp, thick shards of fractured crystal dug violently deep into the flesh of his palm. Dark, rich elderberry wine mixed instantly with bright crimson blood, spilling heavily over his scarred knuckles and dripping onto the pristine white linen tablecloth in a steady, morbid rhythm. Lyra flinched violently at the sound, her dark eyes snapping toward her mate. Kaelan was no longer a stoic, detached king. His chest heaved with rapid, ragged breaths. The elegant, sophisticated veneer of the royal sovereign had completely evaporated, replaced instantly by the feral, terrifying presence of an apex beast driven to the absolute edge of madness. His winterstorm eyes had shifted entirely, burning with a blinding, molten gold that indicated his inner wolf was actively fighting to seize control of his human consciousness. He stared at the shimmering silver ribbon wrapped intimately around Lyra's fragile wrist, his upper lip pulling back slightly in a vicious, involuntary, territorial snarl. The scent of crushed pine turned violently acrid, laced heavily with the metallic tang of fresh blood and the terrifying electrical ozone of an impending, catastrophic storm. Valorin simply leaned back in his chair, casually picking up his own silver goblet. He met Kaelan's blazing molten gold stare with absolute, unwavering calm. The rival Alpha King raised his cup a fraction of an inch in a silent, mocking toast to the Alpha, who had been foolish enough to leave his most precious treasure unguarded in the dark. The heavy, iron-reinforced doors of the Alpha King's private quarters slammed shut with a deafening, earth-shaking, violent crash, rattling the ancient granite walls and sending a shower of fine stone dust falling from the vaulted ceiling. Kaelan Ironfall paced the length of his massive, dimly lit bedchamber like a feral beast, trapped inside a suffocating, shrinking cage. The shadows clung to the freezing granite stones, offering no comfort to his fractured mind. The ambient temperature in the room had plummeted drastically, matching the chaotic, catastrophic storm raging inside his soul. Thick, jagged layers of white frost aggressively crept up the large paneled windows, entirely blocking out the moonlight. His heavy combat boots struck the stone floor with a punishing, relentless rhythm. He had completely ignored the deep, bleeding cuts embedded in his right palm. The dark blood had dried and crusted over his knuckles, an angry testament to the complete loss of control he had displayed at the high table. A highly calculated political insult, Kaelan. Garrick Sterling droned relentlessly, pacing near the large, roaring hearth at the center of the room. The lead council Eldar was entirely unbothered by the freezing temperature. His sharp, clinical mind focused strictly on the diplomatic implications of the evening. King Valorin is openly testing the rigid structure of our hierarchy. By elevating a broken, low-status archive Maid to the high table, he is actively mocking Ironfall's absolute dominance. He wants to see if you are weak enough to allow a foreign sovereign to dictate the rules of your own court. Kaelan stopped pacing abruptly, his broad shoulders heaving as he drew a sharp, ragged breath into his burning lungs. The physical agony radiating from his chest was entirely unbearable. The invisible, severed tether of the fated mate bond was violently ripping him apart from the inside out. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Valorin's massive hand gently tying that shimmering silver ribbon around Lyra's fragile wrist. He saw the profound, breathless shock in Lyra's beautiful dark eyes that used to look at him with a quiet, guarded hope, eyes that now only held terror and freezing despair. It was not a political insult, Garrick, Kaelan growled, his voice dropping into a terrifying, guttural register that vibrated dangerously with pure, untamed wolf dominance. He was claiming her. Preposterous, Garrick scoffed sharply, waving a dismissive hand as he stared into the hearth flames. King Valorin does not claim broken, invisible servants. It was a tactical provocation, and it proves exactly why you must anchor your lineage with a high-born Luna immediately. Kaelan, we cannot afford to show a fragmented, vulnerable front to his northern kingdom. Kaelan's jaw locked sightly, the heavy bones ached. He had believed his silence would protect her from the vicious, scheming council. He had convinced himself that keeping their fated bond a heavily guarded secret was the only way to save Lyra from being exiled by Garrick's pure-blood traditionalists. Instead, it became the moment Kaelan Ironfall's entire world shattered. His cowardice had not protected her. It had systematically starved her, broken her spirit, and left her entirely vulnerable to a rival alpha who possessed the courage and the sovereign power to treat her like a goddess in front of the entire realm. A sharp, disciplined knock echoed rapidly against the heavy iron doors. "Enter!" Kaelan barked, his molten gold eyes snapping toward the entrance. Sariel Thorne stepped quickly into the freezing bedchamber, immediately dropping into a crisp, rigid bow. The royal guard's expression was an unreadable mask of absolute tactical professionalism, but the tense line of his broad shoulders betrayed the critical severity of his report. "Speak, Sariel," Kaelan demanded, his heart beginning to hammer a frantic, sickening rhythm against his ribs. "Alpha," Sariel began, his voice tight and measured. Following the banquet, King Valorin did not return to the guest quarters. He personally escorted Lyra Vance back to the lower archives. Over the passing days of this summit, the Shadowvale delegates have completely surrounded the library entrances. They established a heavily armed, defensive perimeter. We maintained our distance to prevent an incident just as you ordered. Garrick spun around from the hearth, his face flushing with immediate righteous outrage. He dares to post foreign troops inside the walls of Ironfall. This is an unprecedented violation of the treaty terms. Order the Royal Guard to clear them out immediately. "Kaelan!" Sariel did not look at the elder. He kept his sharp gaze locked firmly on his Alpha King. "There is more, Alpha Kaelan. King Valorin's lead general intercepted me at the corridor crossing. He delivered a formal diplomatic mandate. At sunrise on this 7th and final day of the summit, the rival Alpha intends to formally request Lyra Vance's permanent transfer to his northern kingdom. He has declared her under his personal, absolute, sovereign protection. If we attempt to cross his guards, it will be considered a direct act of war." The words hung in the freezing air of the bedchamber. A lethal, devastating death sentence that completely severed the last remaining thread of Kaelan's political restraint. In the agonizing depths of his severed bond, Kaelan could almost hear the quiet, devastating finality in Lyra's soul. The hollow ache in his chest echoed her silent resignation. "Thank you for letting me go." Because being let go had allowed her to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and she would never, ever look back. The thought alone was a lethal poison, burning through his veins and instantly incinerating every single diplomatic lie he had built over the last 2 years. A deafening, visceral roar of absolute feral fury ripped violently from Kaelan's chest. The terrifying sound shook the ancient granite walls to their very foundations, causing the thick glass of the panelled windows to spiderweb and completely shatter outward into the winter storm. Moving with a blinding, lethal speed that defied human physics, Kaelan lunged across the room. He seized the massive, solid oak dining table, resting in the center of his quarters, and flipped it effortlessly. The incredibly heavy furniture launched through the air and smashed violently against the stone wall, exploding into 1,000 jagged, splintered fragments of ruined wood. "Alpha!" Garrick shouted, scrambling backward in genuine, absolute terror as the King of Ironfall finally, completely unleashed the suppressed monster he had buried for the sake of the crown. Kaelan ignored the elder entirely. He stood amidst the shattered ruins of his chamber, his broad chest heaving violently, his eyes completely consumed by the burning, molten gold of his territorial beast. The political treaties did not matter. The ancient pure-blood alliances did not matter. Garrick's relentless, scheming demands meant absolutely nothing. King Valorin had just walked into his absolute stronghold and dared to reach for the one piece of Kaizen's soul he could not survive without. She was wrong. Because the Alpha King had finally discovered the truth, and he was coming for what was his. Kaelan turned on his heel, his heavy combat boots crunching loudly over the shattered glass, and marched directly toward the heavy iron doors, leaving the frantic council elder behind as he went to claim his fated mate. He spent the agonizing, remaining hours of the long night tracking the precise movements of Valorin's heavily armed delegates, pacing the freezing, shadowed corridors as he gathered every ounce of his shattered resolve for the inevitable dawn. Sunrise of the 7th day. The bitter, relentless winter storm that had battered the outer walls of the fortress all night had finally broken, leaving the morning sky a stark, blinding, and cloudless blue. The early piercing light poured harshly through the towering stained glass windows of the grand banquet hall, illuminating the chaotic, catastrophic remnants of the previous night's disastrous feast. Servants were quietly and frantically clearing the heavy oak tables, their movements anxious and hurried as they attempted to erase the visual evidence of the royal court's collective humiliation. The air was thick, smelling heavily of stale spiced wine, cold roasted meats, and the lingering, aggressive pheromones of terrified nobility. Alpha King Kaelin Ironfall had not slept a single second. He had marched straight from his completely ruined bedchamber into the grand hall, driven by a suffocating, primal desperation that aggressively overrode every ounce of his highly trained diplomatic discipline. His physical body was rapidly deteriorating under the immense, crushing strain of the actively severing fated bond. A phantom, jagged cold had begun to spread from his chest down to his extremities, mirroring the exact freezing agony he had forced upon his mate for 24 agonizing months. His lungs burned with every breath. In his uninjured left hand, he gripped a heavy crystal wine glass filled with dark, undiluted morning liquor, a futile, pathetic attempt to dull the violent, tearing agony localized directly behind his ribs. But his path to the subterranean stairwells, his desperate route to the lower archives, was completely blocked. Standing in the exact center of the polished granite floor, completely bathed in the sharp, unforgiving morning light, was Alpha King Valorin Shadowvale. The rival sovereign was absolutely immaculate, dressed in heavy traveling leathers and midnight blue furs that seemed to absorb the ambient brightness of the room. He was flanked entirely by his elite shadow guard. These massive, silent warriors wielded long, dark steel halberds, their faces obscured by heavy iron visors. They formed an impenetrable, highly disciplined wall of lethal protection, standing with a terrifying stillness that sharply contrasted with the chaotic, nervous shifting of the Ironfall soldiers. Elder Garrick Sterling and the rest of the High Council were already present, standing opposite the rival delegation. The wealthy, aristocratic lords of Ironfall looked frantic, pale, and entirely out of their depth. The rigid political situation they had so carefully engineered had violently escalated far beyond their arrogant, narrow-minded calculations. Valorin turned smoothly as Kaelin approached. The rival king's violet eyes were entirely devoid of fear, radiating a calm, absolute, and lethal authority. In his scarred, powerful hand rested a thick, rolled parchment, sealed with the heavy black wax of the Northern Territory. Garrick stepped forward immediately, his voice trembling heavily with undisguised political panic. "Alpha Kaelin, thank the ancestors you are here. King Valorin is attempting to force a highly irregular, unprovoked mandate upon our court. We have cited 3 separate ancestral treaty clauses regarding the unauthorized acquisition of Ironfall citizens, yet he refuses to listen. You must order the Royal Guard to expel his delegation immediately before this public insult destabilizes the entire border." Valorin silenced the frantic elder with a single, dark, withering look. The oppressive, terrifying weight of his sovereign shadow magic rippled outward across the polished floor, a heavy, crackling ozone that physically forced the armed Ironfall guards to instinctively retreat a full step. Valorin shifted his sharp gaze directly to Kaelin, completely ignoring the sputtering council members. The visual and physical contrast between the 2 supreme rulers was staggering. Kaelin was a ragged, volatile mess of barely contained violence. His breathing was shallow and ragged, his jaw locked so tightly the heavy bones ached, and his winter storm eyes flickered dangerously, aggressively fighting the golden hue of his inner beast. Valorin, by stark contrast, was a flawless monument of unbroken, serene supremacy. "Alpha Kalen of Ironfall," Valorin spoke, his impossibly deep baritone effortlessly echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings, carrying absolute authority. "As the sun rises on the final day of this summit, I stand before your council to formalize my diplomatic mandate. I officially request the permanent transfer of Lyra Vance to the Kingdom of Valdris. She will depart with my delegation within the hour, not as a forgotten servant, not as a political pawn, but as the highly honored protected guest of my sovereign crown." The words struck Kaelen like a physical, brutal execution. The invisible, severely damaged fated bond inside his chest screamed with a blinding, catastrophic agony. The absolute finality of Valorin's formal request meant that Lyra was truly, permanently leaving. The silent, incredibly resilient woman who had scrubbed his stone floors, the true mate he had cowardly hidden in the dark to appease a corrupt, scheming council, was going to ride away with a king who actually recognized her immense worth. "You cannot have her," Kaelen growled, his voice a low, terrifying, gravelly rasp that barely sounded human, vibrating heavily with pure, untamed wolf dominance. Valorin tilted his dark head, his expression completely unsympathetic, his violet eyes locking onto the broken king. "You left her to freeze in the dark, Kaelen. A neglected bond is a forfeited bond. The ancient laws are entirely clear on this matter. You chose your political throne. You chose the approval of these weak, scheming elders. I am choosing the girl with the stars in her veins." The absolute confirmation that Valorin had seen exactly how beautiful and supreme Lyra truly was, that the rival Alpha recognized the rare celestial magic flowing through her failing body, acted as the final, devastating trigger. Kaelen's highly trained political restraint evaporated completely into absolute, violent ash. The heavy iron chains of his royal duty, his loyalty to his council, and his arrogant pride shattered completely, leaving nothing behind but the raw, desperate instincts of a fated mate who was about to lose his soul. His winterstorm eyes shifted entirely, permanently burning with a blinding, molten, feral gold in a sudden, violent territorial snap. The heavy crystal wineglass, clutched in his left hand, exploded instantly under the immense, crushing pressure of his sudden grip. Sharp, thick shards of broken crystal bit deeply into his palm, sending fresh, dark blood dripping steadily onto the polished granite floor. But Kaelen did not even blink. He did not feel the physical pain of his torn flesh. It was absolutely nothing, compared to the apocalyptic devastation tearing through his heart. His inner wolf violently seized total control of his human consciousness. The overwhelming, ambient scent of crushed pine and winter frost turned instantly into an explosive, suffocating storm of pure, unadulterated apex predator fury. Kaelen unleashed a deafening, catastrophic territorial roar. It was not a shout. It was a raw, visceral, earth-shattering sound of absolute, bleeding agony and supreme, possessive rage. The sheer sonic force of the Alpha King's feral dominance exploded outward in a massive, invisible shockwave of raw kinetic magic. The towering, intricate stained glass windows lining the grand banquet hall could not withstand the immense, expanding pressure of his unleashed aura. With a simultaneous, deafening crack that sounded like a thunder strike inside the room, the massive panes of ancient glass completely shattered. Thousands of brilliant, colorful shards exploded inward, raining down upon the polished granite floor like a torrential downpour of glittering, lethal diamonds. The remaining crystal goblets and heavy silver pitchers resting on the long oak tables burst violently into fine dust. The Ironfall Council members, including Elder Garrick, dropped immediately to their knees, covering their heads in absolute terror as the freezing winter wind howled aggressively through the ruined, gaping window frames. Kaelen stood amidst the falling glass, his broad chest heaving violently, his elongated fangs fully descended. "She is mine," he snarled, the words vibrating with a dark, lethal promise that shook the very foundations of the ancient keep. She is my true mate. She is the Luna of Ironfall, and no one, not even a king, will take her from this fortress. Valorin did not flinch as the sharp glass rained down around him. He simply rolled the dark parchment scroll in his hand and offered a slow, deliberate nod of profound challenge, completely unbothered by the feral display. "Then I suggest you stop standing here roaring at the empty wind, Alpha," Valorin replied coolly, his violet eyes completely steady as they met Kaelin's golden stare, "and go down to the cellar to prove you are worthy of keeping her, because she is currently packing her bags and she does not strike me as a woman who will wait much longer for a coward to find his courage." The descent into the absolute depths of Ironfall Keep was a harsh transition from chaotic violence into freezing, forgotten silence. Lyra Vance's small, windowless stone chamber was located at the very end of a damp, drafty corridor far beneath the grand courtyards. The room was no larger than a meager supply closet, furnished only with a narrow, constantly creaking wooden cot, a single battered trunk, and a small, heavily rusted iron washbasin. The ambient air here was incredibly stale, smelling heavily of damp granite, old crumbling parchment, and the bitter, sharp bite of subterranean winter that seemed to seep directly through the ancient stones. Lyra stood beside the small bed, carefully folding a faded, threadbare woolen shawl. She moved with a slow, deliberate, mechanical precision, her dark eyes completely dry and devoid of any dramatic tears. The somatic, physical agony that had plagued her for 2 relentless years had finally shifted into a strange, detached emotional numbness. Around her left wrist, securely covering the dead, freezing crescent of her ununcored bond, rested the rare, moon-woven silver ribbon King Valorin had tied the night before. The exquisite material continued to radiate a soft, ethereal starlight warmth. It was a localized, gentle heat that pressed intimately against her bruised skin, acting as a magical tourniquet that actively held the freezing void in her chest at bay. The stark sensory contrast between the absolute, biting frost of her unencored fated bond and the protective, honorable warmth of the rival king's gift was a constant, dizzying reminder of the incredible choice that had finally been laid before her. She folded her meager grey serving dresses, pressing them neatly into the bottom of her bag. She did not own anything of true monetary value. There were no ancestral jewels, no silken gowns, no heavy gold coins to her name. The sum total of her existence in Ironfall Keep fit entirely and easily inside a single worn leather satchel. The heavy wooden door of her chamber creaked open, the rusted iron hinges groaning softly in the quiet, damp air. Evelyn Blackwood stepped into the dim, flickering, candlelit chamber. The head archivist carried a thick woven wool cloak lined heavily with pure white rabbit fur, along with a small parcel of dried, salted meats wrapped carefully in waxed paper. Evelyn's amber eyes were soft, lined with deep, heavy sorrow, but she stood tall, radiating a fierce, undeniable maternal pride that warmed the freezing room. "The Shadowvale guards are fully assembled in the outer corridor," Evelyn murmured quietly, setting the heavy, luxurious cloak gently onto the edge of the cot. "They are highly disciplined, Lyra. They have formed a complete, unbroken shield wall around the archive entrance. King Valorin has made it absolutely clear to his generals that no Ironfall soldier will be allowed to touch you or delay your departure." Lyra paused, her pale, trembling fingers tracing the rough edge of a simple carved wooden comb. "I never intended to start a war, Evelyn," she whispered, her voice incredibly fragile, barely carrying over the freezing draft, rattling loudly under the door. "I just wanted to disappear into the background. I just wanted the freezing cold to finally stop." Evelyn stepped forward, the earthy, deeply familiar scent of crushed ginger and dried nightshade wrapping comfortingly around Lyra's exhausted frame. The older woman reached out, her weathered, ink-stained hands gently cupping Lyra's pale, delicate face. "You did not start a war, my brave girl," Evelyn said, her tone thick with absolute, unwavering conviction. You simply stopped carrying the crushing weight of a cowardly king's mistakes. For 2 agonizing years, you bled your sacred cosmic magic into the frozen stones of this ungrateful fortress. You allowed that hollow mark to aggressively devour your life force, because you believed your silence and your sacrifice would grant him the political peace he claimed he needed. But peace built on the destruction of a fated mate is a fragile, toxic illusion that was always destined to shatter. Lyra closed her eyes, leaning heavily into the rough, grounding warmth of Evelyn's coal-used palms. The profound validation in the older woman's words felt like a soothing, medicinal balm against a raw, desperately exposed wound. Evelyn's thumbs gently stroked Lyra's prominent cheekbones, her amber eyes glowing with ancient wisdom. I have read every single ancient ledger in the restricted archives, Lyra. I know the true hidden history of the Veil Walkers. Your sacred lineage was not meant to scrub stone floors in the dark. Sunborn fire and lunar shifts allowed, violently destructive magics meant for brutal combat and conquest. But a Veil Walker possesses the magic of absolute truth. You were meant to see clearly through the deceptive illusions of the world. You were meant to stand proudly beside a supreme ruler and keep his soul permanently anchored to the light. Kaelin Ironfall was handed a celestial goddess, and he foolishly chose to listen to the empty whispers of corrupt politicians. Evelyn stepped back, picking up the heavy, fur-lined cloak and draping it securely over Lyra's fragile, shivering shoulders. King Valoran recognizes exactly what you are. The Shadowvale Pack is ruthless in battle, yes, but they worship ancient power above all else. He will place you in a safe, luxurious sanctuary. He will allow your dormant magic to breathe, to expand, to finally heal without the constant, suffocating pressure of an unrequited bond aggressively crushing your chest. Lyra pulled the edges of the warm cloak tightly around her body. The heavy rabbit fur provided an immediate, overwhelming sense of physical security she had not felt since she was a child. She looked slowly around the tiny, dismal stone cell that had been her entire, claustrophobic world. She had suffered agonizing, silent humiliation here. She had faded into a translucent, invisible ghost here, but she had also survived. She had not broken under the immense pressure. She had not crawled on her bruised knees to the high table to beg a king for pathetic crumbs of affection. "I will miss the smell of the old books," Lyra admitted softly, a small, genuine, incredibly melancholic smile finally touching the corners of her pale lips. "I will miss you, Evelyn. You were the only true, unconditional warmth I had in this endless, brutal winter. And you were the brightest, most beautiful star in my dark library," Evelyn replied, a single glistening tear slipping quietly down her wrinkled cheek. She quickly wiped it away, her expression hardening back into fierce, protective resolve. "Now, finish packing your satchel. The morning sun is fully up. It is time for you to walk out of this cursed keep with your head held high, and never, ever look back." Lyra nodded, taking a deep, fortifying breath as she reached for the small leather bag. Before her trembling fingers could even brush the coarse leather strap, the entire stone chamber violently shuddered. A sudden, catastrophic tremor ripped aggressively through the subterranean granite walls, vibrating so intensely that the single tallow candle sitting on the wash basin instantly tipped over and extinguished, plunging the small room into dim, terrifying grey shadows. The fine ancient dust coating the stone ceiling rained down in a thick, choking cloud. Then the terrifying sound finally reached them. It was a deafening, earth-shattering, purely feral roar that echoed violently down the long, winding stairwells from the upper banquet hall. The sheer sonic force of the Alpha King's unleashed territorial dominance carried an overwhelming, oppressive wave of raw, kinetic magic that aggressively rattled the heavy iron hinges of Lyra's door. Lyra gasped loudly, stumbling backward in sheer panic until her spine hit the freezing, damp stone wall. The severed cosmic tether instantly flared to life with a blinding, agonizing intensity. The sub-zero, glacial ache violently spiked, aggressively fighting against the soothing starlight warmth of the silver ribbon wrapped around it. Her heart slammed a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her bruised ribs. The ambient air in the tiny cellar suddenly felt incredibly thick, overwhelmingly heavy with the hyper-masculine, hyper-aggressive scent of crushed pine needles, electrical ozone, and raw, bleeding desperation. "He has lost control," Evelyn breathed, her amber eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock as she stared at the heavy wooden door vibrating in its frame. The Alpha has completely surrendered to his beast. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut, her pale hands clutching the edges of her fur-lined cloak as a catastrophic, violent wave of physical dizziness crashed heavily over her. The severed fated bond, dormant and desperately suppressed for 2 long years, was suddenly, violently pull horse with the unstoppable gravitational force of a dying star. Kaelan Ironfall was no longer hiding securely behind his perfect political mask. The stoic, unfeeling king was dead, and the massive, terrified monster he had kept deeply buried was concurrently tearing through the absolute depths of the keep, completely destroying everything in his path to reach the exact room where she stood. The heavy wooden door of Lyra's windowless stone chamber did not simply open. It was violently shattered from its rusted iron hinges. The ancient oak splintered into jagged fragments, exploding inward. A massive cloud of grey stone dust billowed into the tiny cellar, momentarily obscuring the towering silhouette standing in the ruined doorway. Alpha King Kaelan Ironfall stepped into the flickering light of the single remaining candle. His physical appearance was absolute proof of the feral madness that had seized his human consciousness. His silver-threaded formal furs were torn, hanging loosely over his broad, heaving chest. Blood dripped steadily from his injured right hand, pooling menacingly on the damp granite floor. The ambient air in the cramped room instantly plummeted to a sub-zero temperature, heavily saturated with the suffocating pheromones of an apex predator driven to the absolute brink. The moment his imposing frame crossed the threshold, the frost-bitten seal etched into her skin screamed with an agonizing intensity. The physical proximity to her wildly unstable fated mate triggered a violent, tearing sensation behind her ribs. It felt as though a jagged blade of pure glacier ice was being aggressively twisted directly into her failing heart. She stumbled backward, her spine hitting the freezing, damp stone wall as she pulled the white rabbit fur cloak tightly around her trembling shoulders, her dark eyes wide with helpless terror. For 2 relentless years, Lyra had survived in these drafty subterranean shadows, quietly organizing dusty tomes, while the agonizing frost of rejection slowly hollowed out her magic. She had accepted her desolate fate with a quiet, observant strength, refusing to beg for a king who would not acknowledge her. But now that same king was standing in her sanctuary, completely undone. Kaelan's gaze locked onto her, and the terrifying molten gold of his inner beast flared brilliantly in the dim shadows. But as his eyes tracked over her fragile, shivering frame, taking in the packed leather satchel resting on the cot and the heavy traveling cloak draped over her shoulders, the feral gold violently fractured. It shattered like the stained glass windows in the hall above, instantly dissolving back into the turbulent, storm-grey eyes of a deeply broken, desperate man. The colossal, invincible warlord of the Northern Territories did not roar. He did not issue a sovereign command or bare his fangs in a display of territorial dominance. Instead, Kaelan Ironfall collapsed. His heavy combat boots gave way, and he dropped to his knees with a dull, heavy thud that reverberated through the subterranean floor. The sheer, staggering contrast between his massive, terrifying physical scale and the absolute, weeping submission of his posture was a visceral, heart-breaking sight. He bowed his dark head, his broad, heavily muscled shoulders shaking violently as a ragged, agonizing sob tore its way out of his raw throat. He did not dare to reach out. He did not presume to touch her. The Alpha crawled forward over the damp, freezing stones, stopping just inches from the hem of her grey serving dress, and pressed his forehead directly against the cold floor at her feet. His massive chest rose and fell in jagged, broken rhythms, completely abandoning the terrifying, untouchable facade he had maintained for years. Every trembling breath he drew was a devastating testament to his absolute surrender, willingly laying his supreme sovereign pride in the dust before the woman he had wronged. Evelyn Blackwood stood rigidly near the rusted wash-basin, her amber eyes wide with absolute shock at the unprecedented display of royal surrender. The fierce head archivist had prepared to physically shield the young maid from a monster, fully expecting the feral warlord to tear the room apart. She had even reached for the heavy iron fire poker, ready to lay down her own life to protect the fragile girl who had become like a daughter to her. But, as Evelyn watched the massive king tremble on the damp stones, she immediately recognized that the creature weeping on the floor was not a threat. It was a dying mate desperately pleading for his life. With a slow, respectful nod, the older woman acknowledged the profound shift in power. Evelyn quietly stepped through the ruined doorway and into the drafty corridor. She silently took up a guard position to ensure their ultimate confrontation remained undisturbed. "Lirab," Kalen choked out, his deep, gravelly voice completely shattered, barely recognizable through the heavy weight of his tears. "Please, I am begging you, do not walk out those gates. The bond is tearing my soul apart. If you leave this keep with him, my wolf will not survive the night." Lyra stood perfectly still, her pale hands clutching the soft fur of her cloak. She did not instantly fall to her knees to comfort him. The somatic, physical agony she had endured for 2 relentless years had forged an impenetrable, iron shield around her heart. She could not simply forget the countless nights she had spent shivering in this windowless chamber, her innate Veil Walker magic fading into nothingness while he ruled in the blinding light of the court above. "You chose this, Kalen," she whispered, her voice devoid of dramatic anger, completely hollowed out by months of silent suffering. "You chose the political stability of your crown. You chose the approval of Garrick Sterling. You left me in the dark to freeze while you sat on a throne of lies." The broken king lifted his head, his storm-grey eyes completely bloodshot and swimming with raw anguish. He looked up at her not as a ruler, but as a desperately broken man offering his bare throat to the only force that could either save or execute him. "I chose your life," he confessed, the desperate words tumbling from his lips in a frantic, breathless rush. 2 years ago, when the chilling insignia first manifested on your wrist, Garrick Sterling saw the celestial stardust pulsing in your veins. Lyra's breath hitched painfully in her dry throat, the sudden revelation piercing through her emotional numbness. She had always believed her supreme magical lineage was a perfectly kept secret, hidden safely in the dusty shadows of the lower library, buried within the ancient ledgers she meticulously cleaned. To hear that her deepest truth had been weaponized against her sent a fresh wave of freezing dread down her spine. "The council elders are terrified of the ancient magic," Kalen continued, his uninjured hand clenching into a tight, trembling fist against the stone floor. "Garrick Sterling cornered me in the war room. He explicitly threatened that if I publicly claimed a supreme truth-sayer as my Luna, a woman who could effortlessly see through their decades of political corruption, he would have you quietly eliminated in the night. He controlled the royal guard. He controlled the food supply. I was surrounded by traitors, Lyra. Tears streamed freely down the Alpha King's scarred cheeks, cutting through the fine stone dust coating his skin. I thought if I completely ignored you, if I made them believe you were nothing but a worthless, broken mistake that I deeply regretted, they would let you live. I thought keeping you hidden in the archives was a sanctuary, but I was just cowardly building a prison. Because when I saw you sitting at that high table, wearing Alpha Valorin's colors, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me. The heavy, agonizing truth of his confession hung thickly in the freezing air. Lyra's innate, dormant Veilwalker magic flared instinctively, analyzing the fundamental resonance of his words. He was not lying. The absolute, unvarnished truth radiated from his broken soul. Kaelan had completely sacrificed his own happiness, enduring the exact same severing agony of the fated bond, all in a desperate, deeply flawed attempt to keep her breathing. He had chosen the freezing isolation of the curse, just to ensure she survived another dawn. But understanding his tragic motivation did not instantly erase the severe, physical deterioration aggressively wearing down her body. She looked down at the rare moon-woven silver ribbon wrapped securely around her left wrist. The exquisite material, gifted by the charismatic rival Alpha, continued to pulse with a soft, protective starlight warmth, actively fighting back the lethal frost radiating from her cold claiming mark. Alpha Valorin Shadowvale had seen her worth immediately. He had not hesitated to publicly elevate a supposedly broken Omega, offering her the sanctuary of his own kingdom without demanding anything in return. The ribbon was a tangible reminder that she was not inherently unlovable or fundamentally defective. She was a supreme being whose light had simply been suffocated by cowardly men. "Protection built on silence is just a cage, Kaelan," Lyra murmured, her voice gaining a quiet, undeniable strength that echoed firmly off the damp walls. "You allowed fear to dictate our destiny." Alpha Valorin did not hide me in the shadows. He walked directly into a hostile keep, completely surrounded by your armed forces. And he put a crown of starlight on my wrist, in front of the exact same men who want me gone. He gave me the light when you only offered me the dark. Kaelan flinched violently, the undeniable truth of her words striking him with the brutal force of a physical blow. He reached out with his trembling left hand, his long fingers hovering mere inches from the hem of her dress, desperately terrified to touch her without explicit permission. "I will dismantle this entire political court for you," he vowed, his voice dropping into a dark, resolute promise. "I will tear down Garrick Sterling's legacy. I will banish every single elder who ever looked at you with disdain. Just tell me what you need me to do, Lyra. I will do anything." The archive maid looked down at the most powerful, terrifying male in 3 realms, watching him completely surrender his supreme sovereignty at her feet. She did not want vengeance or cruelty. She did not want to rule over a broken, bleeding court. She simply wanted the undeniable, absolute validation that had been stolen from her. She wanted the truth to step out of the shadows. "I will not be a secret kept in the dark, Kaelan," Lyra declared, her dark eyes locking onto his with a fierce, burning intensity. "I will not accept a quiet apology in a hidden cellar. If you want me to stay, you will walk me up those stairs. You will lead me into the grand hall. You will kneel before the entire court, before Garrick Sterling, and before Alpha Valorin. You will publicly denounce the Council's treason, and you will claim me in the blinding light of day. If you cannot do that, then I will leave with Valorin, and I will never, ever look back." Kaelan did not hesitate for a single microscopic fraction of a second. The heavy, paralyzing chains of his political duty had already been completely incinerated by the terrifying prospect of losing her forever. "Yes," he breathed, the word carrying the absolute, unbreakable weight of a sacred vow. "I will give you the sun, the moon, and the entire court on their knees." He slowly pushed himself up from the damp floor, his massive frame towering over her in the tiny chamber. He did not attempt to wipe the tears from his scarred face. He did not try to hide the raw devastation of his emotions. With slow, meticulous reverence, he offered her his uninjured left hand. Lyra stared at his corlused palm for a long, heavy moment. She thought of the ancient ledger Evelyn had shown her, detailing the sovereign power of her ancestors. The time for hiding was over, when her pale, freezing fingers finally slipped into his warm grasp. A sharp electric spark of agonizing anticipation shot directly up her arm, signaling the impending collision of their long-denied souls. The journey upward from the subterranean cellars was a profound, surreal transition from forgotten shadows into the harsh, glaring reality of the upper world. Lyra walked silently beside the Alpha King, her small hand enveloped entirely in his massive grip. The heavy white rabbit fur cloak swept elegantly over the cold stone steps. Every rhythmic thud of Kaelin's heavy combat boots against the granite stairs felt like a definitive strike against the fragile, toxic political illusion that had governed Ironfall Keep for centuries. As they ascended, the ambient temperature began to shift, the biting frost of the lower depths giving way to the tense, suffocating atmosphere of the royal level. When they finally breached the upper landing and stepped through the towering, arched entryway of the grand banquet hall, the chaotic, tense atmosphere of the room instantly froze into a rigid, breathless silence. The freezing winter wind continued to howl aggressively through the shattered, gaping frames of the destroyed stained glass windows, sending a fine dusting of sparkling snow swirling across the polished floor. The visual impact of their entrance was staggering. The ferocious, terrifying Alpha of Ironfall, a man who had just unleashed a terrifying display of territorial fury, was now walking calmly and protectively beside a lowly, grey-clad archive maid. Hundreds of wealthy, aristocratic nobles and elite courtiers stared in absolute, wide-eyed shock. Standing in the exact center of the ruined hall, perfectly framed by his highly trained Shadowvale guards, Alpha King Valorin Shadowvale watched their approach. Valorin's striking violet eyes were sharp and highly observant, registering the fundamental shift in Kaelin's aura with a calm, validating respect. Garrick Sterling, who had just managed to scramble back to his feet following Kaelin's catastrophic roar, stepped forward. His face was flushed with a dangerous, apoplectic rage, his clinical scent completely soured by sheer political panic. "Alpha, what is the meaning of this absolute madness?" Garrick Sterling shouted, completely abandoning any pretense of diplomatic decorum. "You bring this broken servant into the light? You humiliate our crown before the rival king over a defective Omega." Kaelin did not roar. He did not unleash his feral beast. The Alpha King stopped in the center of the hall, gently releasing Lyra's hand to stand firmly in front of her, placing his massive body as an impenetrable physical shield between his mate and the hostile council. The silence that followed was heavy and thick, pulsing with the dangerous promise of a predator who had finally stopped playing by the rules of his prey. "Silence," Kaelin commanded. The single word was not loud, but it carried the overwhelming, crushing weight of absolute sovereign authority, forcing the ambient atmospheric pressure in the room to plummet. Garrick Sterling choked, his mouth snapping shut, as the invisible kinetic weight of the Alpha Command slammed directly into his chest, forcing the breath from his lungs. Kaelin's winter storm eyes locked onto the corrupt elder, completely devoid of any remaining political mercy. He let the crushing silence stretch, ensuring every member of the court felt the absolute finality of the moment before he spoke again. "Garrick Sterling." The king's voice echoed flawlessly off the vaulted ceilings, ringing with lethal precision. "For the crime of high treason, for conspiring to eliminate the true, sacred Lunar of Ironfall, and for actively attempting to suppress a supreme celestial bloodline, you are hereby stripped of all titles, lands, and authority." The entire court gasped in sheer, unadulterated horror. The political foundation of Ironfall was violently collapsing right before their eyes. The ancient power structures were being dismantled with a single sentence. "Sariel Thorn," Kaelin barked, his gaze never leaving the trembling elder. "Detain him. If he speaks another word of disrespect against my mate, remove him from this keep permanently." Sariel Thorn stepped forward instantly from the perimeter guard. Without a single moment of hesitation, the loyal royal guard seized the protesting elder by the heavy fabric of his aristocratic robes, swiftly forcing him to the polished granite floor and securing his wrists in heavy iron chains. The sharp clank of the metal echoed like a death knell for the corrupt regime. The rest of the council elders shrank back in absolute terror, instantly recognizing that the era of their manipulative dominance had just been permanently eradicated. With the immediate, toxic threat finally neutralized, Kalen turned his full, undivided attention back to Lyra. The chaotic, deafening noise of the shocked court faded entirely into a distant, irrelevant hum. There was only the freezing wind, the glittering diamonds of shattered glass on the floor, and the incredibly fragile, beautiful woman standing before him. In front of hundreds of astounded nobles, in front of the highly disciplined rival delegation, the most feared warlord in the Northern Territories dropped smoothly to his knees for the second time that morning. He knelt not in defeat, but in absolute, sovereign devotion. The collective, horrified gasp of the Ironfall courtiers was a sweet, poetic symphony of absolute vindication. It was the undeniable proof of her worth, witnessed by the very people who had once treated her as completely invisible. Kalen reached up, his large, trembling hands gently taking Lyra's left wrist. He stared down at the exquisite moon-woven silver ribbon that Valoran had tied around her arm. Kalen did not rip it away in a fit of feral jealousy. He recognized it for exactly what it was, a lifeline that had kept his mate breathing when he had failed her. With slow, meticulous reverence, the kneeling king untied the shimmering fabric. He did not cast it aside in anger. He turned slightly and extended his right hand, offering the rare silk back to the rival king. Valoran Shadowvale stepped forward smoothly, taking the silver ribbon with a calm, deeply respectful nod. The charismatic rival Alpha locked his striking violet eyes briefly with Kalen's storm-grey gaze, a silent, profound communication passing between the two supreme rulers. Valoran had never truly intended to start a war. He had simply intended to force a coward to finally find his courage and claim his rightful throne. With a faint, knowing smile, the rival Alpha stepped back, allowing the fated mates to finally close the impossible distance between them. Kalen turned back to Lyra, his complete focus entirely consumed by the dead, freezing crescent scar resting on her pale skin. He gently cradled her arm, giving her one final breathless moment to pull away if she chose, but Lyra did not pull away. The icy crescent throbbed with a desperate, agonizing, sub-zero pulse, a final, screaming plea for the cavernous void to be filled. The Alpha closed his eyes, leaning forward in complete submission, and pressed his warm, trembling lips directly against the icy scar. The physical activation of the long-denied fated mate bond was a catastrophic, overwhelming, somatic explosion. The jagged, lethal glacier ice that had frozen Lyra's veins for 2 years instantly shattered into a million insignificant pieces. A massive, roaring rush of molten gold, searing summer fire, and blinding starlight violently flooded her bloodstream. The cavernous void in her chest was completely, overwhelmingly filled with the absolute, protective, and unconditional warmth of the Alpha King. The bitter cold of her exile vanished, entirely erased by a love so fierce it threatened to stop her heart. The sheer kinetic force of the completed bond triggered the violent awakening of her dormant, Veilwalker magic. A brilliant, ethereal wave of glowing silver stardust and radiant golden light erupted physically from Lyra's skin, illuminating the gloomy, ruined banquet hall with the breathtaking brilliance of a captured sun. The crushing, exhausted pallor vanished instantly from her face, replaced by a vibrant, immortal flush of supreme health and undeniable cosmic sovereignty. The celestial energy spiraled upward, weaving through the shattered stained-glass windows and painting the falling winter snow with iridescent hues of violet and gold. The air itself tasted of ozone, honeyed wine, and pure, concentrated summer fire. The overwhelming, sacred pressure of her divine aura slammed outward in a majestic, cascading wave. Every single wolf in the grand hall, the wealthy lords, the arrogant courtiers, the armed guards, instantly dropped to their knees, their bodies forced into absolute, uncontrollable submission by the sheer magnitude of the supreme celestial magic they had so foolishly ignored. The ancient magic resonated deeply within the very stone of Ironfall Keep, formally recognizing its true unyielding queen. Even Alpha Valorin offered a slow, profound bow of his dark head, acknowledging the breathtaking birth of a true celestial ruler before turning smoothly on his heel and leading his highly disciplined Shadowvale guards out of the shattered keep, his noble purpose fully and completely accomplished. Lyra looked down at Kaelin, the blinding, radiant warmth of her fully awakened magic wrapping protectively around his massive kneeling frame. He looked up at her, his storm-grey eyes shining with absolute devotion, profound repentance, and endless relief. The freezing winter that had trapped Ironfall Keep for decades was finally, permanently broken, instantly melted away by the supreme, undeniable light of a queen who had survived the dark, and a king who would spend the rest of his immortal life ensuring she never had to hide in the shadows again.